Today I'm going to talk to you about the other processes that affect rivers and the landforms around them, and they are weathering and mass movement. So weathering is a really important process in river environments in terms of shaping the land and landforms. And the definition of weathering is the breakdown of rock in one place, or what we call a phrase in situ, without, and that's a really key word, a moving force. So the key thing that we need to distinguish between weathering and erosion is that erosion has to have a moving force, where weathering doesn't have a moving force. So there are three types of weathering, and I'm going to start with physical weathering, which is shown in this picture here. And this is where the rock is broken down into smaller pieces, and it's largely due to changes in temperature, but also sometimes we have rainfall involved. The example I've shown you here is something that is called freeze-thaw. And this happens where you have changes in the temperature. So if you can see this rock here, if I was going to draw the rock, it's got a natural crack in it that's happened. And what happens is water would fall into that when it rains and fill up. And then eventually what would happen is overnight when the temperatures drop, that would freeze. And then so when this freezes, what happens is the ice, obviously, as we know, that water expands when it freezes. And so when the kind of water expands as it turns into ice, it puts pressure on the rock around it. And so what we get happening is, if this happens over a long period of time, we get freezes during the night, and then it melts away, and then more water goes back in. And as we continue to have that, water goes in the day, freezes at night, expands, puts pressure on the rock around it. Eventually what will happen is you'll get a split in the rock, as we can see here. And this has obviously happened as a long period of time. But we can see all these other lines of weaknesses that are being created by the pressure on the rock, and that could be where more water could fall in and this process could happen again. So this is an example of physical weathering where changes in temperature and rainfall cause the rock to break down. Next up we have biological, and as it states in the name, biological weathering involves some sort of biology, and the biology in this is this tree. It's a growing, living thing, and what's happened here is the roots of the plant have actually got into cracks, and what they've then done is, as they've grown, what has happened is those cracks split apart. It's very similar to the freeze-thaw, but where that involved water and ice expanding. Here it is the root expanding as it grows into that crack, and it's splitting the rock apart. The last bit of weathering to talk about is chemical. And this is where the rock, as we can see here, in lots of these different holes, has decayed or disintegrated. And the reason it's done this is because of rainfall, which has fallen onto this rock, and the fact is that rainfall has a slightly acidic nature. It depends on the amount of CO2 that is absorbed into it, but once CO2 kind of dissolves into rainwater, then it makes it slightly more acidic. And what this does is it kind of breaks down and decays very, very soft rock. So this won't happen on all types of rock, but I'm going to move on in a second to talk about the factors that would affect the rate of weathering. We now need to look at the factors that affect the weathering rate. If we look at physical, and we talked earlier on about freeze-thaw, one of the main things to look in this type of weathering is the important factor is temperature change. So we need there to be conditions so that the water is able to freeze, but then also unfreeze and thaw during the daytime. This enables us to have the expansion, which puts pressure on, but also then the contraction, which leaves the pressure off, and therefore we get this expansion contraction, which what weakens the rock and enables it to happen. If there isn't a temperature change, if we can't have this freezing and thawing, if, for example, it's too cold all the time, then you won't be able to get freeze-thaw happening. So we often get physical weathering happening in rivers in the upland regions because they do have that temperature change. They sometimes have very cold evenings, especially in UK, but then in the mornings and the daytime, that water will unfreeze and therefore contract. We can also say that if you've got higher temperatures, for chemical weathering, then we get a faster rate of reaction. So what I mean by that is that the acid rain that is causing these chemical reactions, if there are higher temperatures, then those reactions can happen quicker. For both of these, as I've just mentioned there, if you've got higher rainfall, in the chemical weathering, you are going to get more chemical weathering. And obviously, if we get slightly higher rainfall in physical, well, then we're going to get kind of more physical weathering because we've got the chance to actually fill in these cracks with the water. So we can also argue that if we have higher temperatures and higher rainfall, then we will get more biological weathering because we get more plant growth if we've got higher temperatures and more rainfall. The conditions for photosynthesis are perfect, so we get more plant growth, and therefore we get an increase in biological weathering. The next process we need to know about that's related to what we've just done is called mass movement, and this is the movement of weathered material down a slope due to the force of gravity. And what I've got in this GIF here is an example of slumping. So slumping happens where the river undercuts the slope next to it, and when it does that, it kind of weakens the slope above it, and because of that, it allows the material, that weathered material above the slope, to fall down. So this particularly happens when there's a lot of rain, because that rain makes all of that weathered material really, really heavy, but it also acts as a lubricant, which allows it to slide a lot easier. The last process we need to talk about is soil creep. This is the slow movement of weathered material due to gravity. So we've got this slope here, and there's been material that's been weathered on it. And as you can see, because of the movement, we can see evidence of the soil creep by it kind of pushes poles over, it can adjust fences, even trees grow in a straight line. That's these curves here show that this material was once up here and has now moved down. Eventually, this material will end up down where our river would be, and when it makes it down to there, that material would be transported and eroded away by the river. As we mentioned previously, obviously if there was high amount of rainfall, that would affect the amount of soil creep, which would go up, and again that is because this ground would become saturated, which would become heavier, and therefore it would move under the force of gravity at a quicker rate.